Fabulous. Alice, thank you so much for
Hello.
joining me today. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Very well. So we'll dive straight in to talk about miracles today. So I think it's probably best if we start off by looking at the definition. So we've just been talking before this about how it's not exclusively a religious concept. So do you want to
Yes.
expand on that a little bit and kind of share your understanding of what a miracle could be defined as?
Well, we can start off with this idea that it's the classic one, it's a violation of a natural law. So
Mhm.
that requires us to understand a bit about what a natural law is, these rules that seem to define how we understand the universe. And that's a very scientific perspective. So that gravity works the way it does, or how the sun moves in the sky, or doesn't, as the case is.
Yeah.
But if we understand what natural laws are, then we can start saying, okay, well, if those break down in some way, or we have an experience that doesn't conform to them, is that miraculous?
Yeah.
So we have loads of biblical examples of those. We have loads of religious examples. But we can also look at stuff like, back in the day when they witnessed kind of eclipses, that would have
Mhm.
been seen as a violation of a natural law.
Yeah.
Even if the common person didn't understand it as a natural law, they would
Yeah.
think, okay, this is not how it usually behaves.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
yeah, we can look at that as a definition of miracle. But I guess we've also got the other stuff, how we use the term colloquially. So
Mhm.
miraculous, the birth of a child, or
Yeah.
winning the lottery,
Mhm.
or just something that is fortuitous, something that is positive in our lives. It's
Yeah.
miraculous that I made the bus, considering I woke up half an hour later than I usually would, or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think you're right. I think it does go way beyond the religious parameters, even though we can explore those. Well, even my background, obviously, it's the passing of the Red Sea for those
Yes.
wondering. So that's kind of, a classic quintessential miracle in some ways. So you can look at it from a sort of technical scientific point of view, like you say, a violation of a natural law, which I think you've rightly pointed out. Certainly, if you look at it in the past and how miracles have been conceptualized then is quite subjective because
Yes.
nowadays we're, further along in terms of our knowledge of natural laws than perhaps people in the past were. So they might have looked at something like, for example, a rainbow and thought of that as miraculous. But then equally, interestingly, there are some religious believers today that still see those things as miraculous, not because they're unscientific, but because they're part of God's scientific laws, if that makes sense. So
Yeah. But
it's an
they
interesting
indicate
one.
something about the nature of God, and
Yeah.
it's some kind of intervention in the world, even if that's within the natural order of things.
Exactly, exactly. And I think it's interesting you talk about nature of God because that's very much a good synoptic link that you can draw here. And in fact, if you look at the etymology of the word miracle, I think in Latin it comes from miraculum, which means wonder. And then if you look at it in the Hebrew, I believe it means sign. So it's wonder and sign,
There we
which is
go.
ideal, isn't it? Because yeah, it's like, well, what is it a sign of? It's a sign of, in this case, perhaps God's power, in other cases, God's love. So yeah, it very
Yeah.
much ties into that topic. Yeah.
And there's also quite a lot you can go there with religious language. If you're thinking about people like Rudolf Bultmann or even Professor David Jenkins, they talk about this idea that actually we need to demythologize miracle.
Yeah.
Really, a literal understanding of a break in the laws of nature gets in the way of all this stuff it could be telling us about the nature of God.
Yeah.
So the resurrection is a fascinating concept,
Mhm.
regardless of whether it happened literally. So
That's a
yeah,
really interesting point, actually, and that kind of ties into something that's on the AQA specification,
lovely.
which is this distinction, I think, between realist and anti-realist views. So maybe we can
Yes.
touch on that a little bit and think about the different ways of looking at, in some cases, the same event, but thinking about it differently. Whether it's a literally true event or something that just holds significance for the believer. So, should we talk a little bit about what the difference is then between a realist and an anti-realist view of
Great.
miracles?
So realist ideas are those that say that there is an objective truth
Yeah.
in the world. So if we're talking about miracle in that context, we're saying, okay, this miracle objectively happened. It's not about whether I'm religious or not religious. It's this event occurred.
Yeah.
So that obviously is going to maybe discount some softer ideas of miracles. So just this happens to be fortuitous for me.
Yeah.
It's going to say, okay, this thing is a violation of the laws of nature, like parting of the Red Sea,
Yeah.
etc.
Hmm.
Whereas our anti-realist ideas are going to encapsulate a lot more ideas of miracle because they're saying, okay, well, what does it say to the individual?
Yeah.
So it's not that there has to be something that's objectively true in the world. It's actually, this means something to me. This is a sign.
Yes.
So we could talk about miracle as a lot, a much broader idea.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are a lot of kind of issues when we think about that in relation to our scientific understanding of the world, but also if someone is a religious believer, how that relates. Because I think there are going to be a lot of religious believers who are saying, well, where does that leave scripture if we say that it doesn't matter whether it actually happened because it matters to me? There's religious believers saying, no, actually the resurrection, we need that. That's essential to the foundations of our beliefs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or, how can I believe in God as an omnipotent being, or an omnibenevolent being if we're saying, oh, actually those miracles weren't about God intervening in the world, and it's just that I feel nice about this event that's happened.
Definitely. And I think that idea again of it being subjective raises issues too. And I think this is something that Maurice Wiles touches upon, this idea that, I mean, I'll give an example actually. It's not particularly a religious example, but could be interpreted in a religious way. So I saw on Instagram earlier, really randomly, or not, depending on how you look at it, an example of somebody who survived 9/11. They were meant to go to the Twin Towers that day, but they were delayed. They got to work late because they were buying the new Mariah Carey CD, which I know. So, and it's interesting because, some religious believers would look at that and be like, miracle, right? That's God looking out for you. But then I read some of the comments actually just out of interest, and they were saying anybody that says that's an act of God, it's a bit of a slap in the face for all the people that weren't saved that day.
Yes.
So it raises issues about this idea of a so-called interventionist God. And it raises, I think, really good questions about the nature of God, the problem of evil. Yeah. Why would it be the case that God would intervene in some cases and save some people's lives, but not everybody? So I think there's some good links there. I think there's some good links with religious language as well, about how we actually talk about God. So yeah, there's lots of different ways I think that we can interpret that. And I like the point about scripture as well, because I think I'm right in saying that Paul said, if you don't believe in the rising from the dead of Christ, then your faith is futile, you're still in your sins. So I've always interpreted that as basically saying that you're not a real Christian if you don't believe in the resurrection, literally. But I'd love to hear your views on that.
I think that's a really interesting point, and also like scripture supporting scripture. I'll go back to the idea of David Jenkins, who's a religious believer, and he has this like often misquoted phrase. He said, the resurrection is not just a conjuring trick with bones. He's often misquoted as saying, it's just a conjuring trick with bones.
Ah, okay.
But his point is, like, yeah, it would be super amazing to think of raising someone from the dead. But at the point we get bogged down in Jesus literally coming back from the dead, we're missing all of this really kind of deep philosophical and theological significance. This idea of rebuilding this relationship between God and humanity, and the idea of sacrifice. And I think that's really interesting, because we spend all this time debating, do these things happen?
Yeah.
Could God have made the bush burn without actually destroying the bush? And could the Red Sea be parted? And what does that say about the nature of God, that he killed the Egyptians but saved the Israelites?
Yeah.
And we get so hat up in those things. And I think David Jenkins is saying, look, like, God isn't just this magician. It's not just I'm going to dabble. It's God's nature is so much more than this.
Yeah.
But to say it's more than just a conjuring trick with bones, we're saying actually, by demythologizing these miracles, we access a deeper understanding of the nature of God. And I think that does link to a lot of about what Wiles is saying. He talks about this idea that miracle would imply that God is arbitrary and partisan.
Yes.
He's just like, I'll save them, but not them, to use that 9/11 example.
Yeah.
Well, great that they were getting Mariah Carey's music, very important, but let's just leave those people to their destiny or whatever.
Yeah.
And this idea of like partisanship, a lot of people have issue with that, particularly if we look at Old Testament miracles, where God is very much like behind this group and against this group.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that was a very long-winded statement of, I can see how the resurrection is obviously the foundation of so much Christian faith, but I don't know how convincing it is to say that a literal understanding is foundational, that it is the be all and end all of what it is.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Because it's so complex, isn't it? You know, so many people describe themselves as Christian and mean something that might not be the same as what other people mean. And I think a lot of people would accept that and not necessarily take issue with that. You know, like some Christians go to church more than others and that sort of thing. So, you know, not really that big a deal from that perspective. Okay, so could you take Jenkins as somebody who's perhaps criticizing more of the strict realist view? This idea that, you know, we have to understand miracles as either being literally occurring or not.
Yeah, I'd absolutely say that. He's definitely a proponent of the anti-realist idea. And I think that that's, as I said, it really relates to a lot of what we talked about in relation to religious language and nature of God.
Yeah.
You know, if we look at a realist idea of miracle, the criticisms of that are quite different, aren't they?
Yeah.
And I think that an anti-realist idea is harder to criticize in some ways if we're looking at violations of natural laws.
Yeah, for sure, which I'd like to circle back to actually from the
Yeah.
perspective of Hume in a bit. On that point, actually, I think it's really interesting when you look at specific examples of miracles. So one that's often interpreted in a religious framework, but again, not necessarily as healing miracles, because if you look at that from a realist view, it's like, okay, well, did it really happen? And it's like, you know, you look at examples of people who, for example, you know, have issues walking and then suddenly they're mobile because they've gone to a faith healer or something like that. And it's like, they do feel better for that time, but it doesn't seem to be a physical thing. So is that something that really happened? You know, like I think I'd take issue with this idea that we can either see things. I think it's more complicated than what it literally happened or it didn't. I think there's some grey areas there. Would you agree?
I absolutely think so. And also, I think that does help play into this idea of defining miracle. If you look at what Thomas Aquinas said, he was saying, okay, it's not just violations of the laws of nature. That's not the only way that we're thinking about miracle. It's things that could happen in the universe, but happen in a slightly different order. Because it's not impossible for someone to be healed in some capacity.
Yeah.
Like we have modern medicine and people also improve from illnesses. But is it still the case that God has intervened in some capacity?
Exactly. And that'd be really hard to measure, wouldn't it? Because you see, for example, instances of people, you know, being cured of cancer. And I heard an example recently of that happening against all odds. Somebody was given, I think, 18 months to live. And then next thing they know, they're in complete remission. And that's no longer the case. So again, if you take the view of, for example, Holland, you could say, well, that's, you know, a subjective thing. It's interpreted in a religious framework. So therefore it's a miracle. But then, like you say, it's not completely out of the realm of possibility that people could be healed through a mixture of different things. Like there's this whole idea of mind over matter, there's the placebo effect. All of these things have a huge impact. And it reminds me a little bit, actually, Derren Brown, who I'm a big fan of, did a show about miracles on Netflix. I don't know if you saw it. I think it's called Derren Brown Miracles.
Okay, I'm gonna have to go and watch this now.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's really, really good. So he again, for those that don't know, Derren Brown, very much I would say a staunch atheist, like definitely not a religious man, and kind of does quite a good job of, as it were, debunking a lot of these things. But he actually takes on the persona and becomes a faith healer for this show, and he's successful in healing people. But he's very sort of, you know, open about it. He says, I'm not doing this with any divine intervention. I'm doing this, and I can give a quote actually where he talks about how this is possible. When these people are healed, and I'm using that in inverted commas because oftentimes it's not a permanent thing, but they do feel better in the moment. He says what's essentially happening psychologically is you get a lot of adrenaline going and you're interrupting what he calls a story. So if you've got somebody, for example, who said, you know, I've had a bad leg my whole life, and they tell themselves that story, they tell the world that story about themselves, Derren Brown can sort of come in and change that story and say, right, you're healed. And that does have a huge impact on people when they're susceptible, when they're in a crowd, when there's a lot of adrenaline going. If you watch actually faith healers in action, there is a lot of that happening. So, you know, the effects are miraculous, but the actual nature of what's happening isn't necessarily miraculous, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we can account for it via other means.
Exactly.
Basically.
Yeah.
And I think that is really interesting. And apologies if I'm jumping into this kind of too early, but if we look at what Hume says about miracles, he talks about the fact that we have a propensity to want to believe the miraculous.
Exactly.
So, you know, we also have to think about the fact that someone who's going to go and see a faith healer, or someone that's going to go on pilgrimage to Lourdes, want something to happen. And we can't look at that and say, well, that definitely means God hasn't intervened. But we have to be kind of looking at it in this frame.
Yeah.
Well, they want something to have occurred here.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's the same. Again, you could say this is miraculous, although I think a lot of Christians would take issue with mediumship. But there's examples of episodes where Derren Brown becomes a psychic medium effectively and so-called communicates with the dead. Again, he very open at the start. He says, I'm not actually doing this, but I can make it look very convincing that I am. People that go to psychic mediums are desperate oftentimes to connect with their loved ones. So like you say, we can't discount that completely and say, oh, okay, well, therefore it's not real. But we do have to be mindful, I think, of the fact that actually, if you're looking for something, it's like the whole cognitive bias idea, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, if you're out there looking for something, it does make it more likely. And again, if you add the subjectivity element to that as well, that people kind of look for signs, again, going back to what a miracle is, a sign where they want to see it, you know, like, for example, if you're somebody that's seeking connection with God and you think, oh, you know, I've been really depressed lately and I just want a sign that God is there. You could wake up in the morning and see something as simple as it being sunny outside and say that's a miracle.
Yeah.
Whereas other people would say that's preposterous. Again, the more realist, you know, people, if you like, people that take that stance would say, well, no, that's not objective. That's just something that is a coincidence and all of that. So, yeah, it's a tricky one, I think.
Very tricky. And I think that oftentimes we have to think about how it is we're testing.
Yes.
If something fits the bill as miraculous, which again is going to be dependent on how we define miracle. But, you know, what kind of testimony are we looking at? What evidence are we going to find compelling and believable?
Yeah, definitely. So I think, like you say, definitions are key. And I mean, a kind of very broad definition that you can find in the dictionary oftentimes is that a miracle is an extraordinary, welcome event that can't be explained by science, so must be caused by God. I'd love to get your opinion on that as a definition, actually, if you think that's a good one. So again, an extraordinary, welcome event that can't be explained by science, so must be caused by God.
It's a lot to unpack in that, isn't there?
Yeah.
I think I'm gonna go contrary to reason, and I'm gonna start at the end. That can't be explained by science, so must be caused by God. I think that is very lazy as a way of looking at the world.
Agreed.
Can't be explained by science implies something very specific about the scientific method and something quite incorrect.
Mm-hmm.
When we say something can't be explained by science, that isn't just, oh, that's it, let's wring our hands, we have nothing left to talk about here. The scientific method is about, okay, what information do I have currently, and what's my best model of the world based on that, and can I find evidence to support it?
Yeah.
So if something can't be explained by science, we have to add in the word yet.
Yeah, I agree completely.
So we can't just kind of open the door and say, come on in, God, this is the only possible explanation.
That's the whole God of the gaps idea, isn't it?
Absolutely. We're just kind of throwing him in there, which I think is problematic for several reasons. Obviously not convincing to those who aren't religious, and those who don't believe in God. I think also some religious believers would say, like, hang on a second, we're just throwing God in willy-nilly at this point. You know, maybe it's unexplainable and fortuitous for you, but actually I don't like throwing God in here because it would undermine something about God's nature.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not the case that all religious believers would be on board with drawing in miracles in that way. Yeah.
And also, like, to go back to Wiles, what he says is that there is one miracle, and that is creation. That's it.
Yes, exactly.
So yeah, this idea, well, we can't explain this thing that has happened, so throw God in there. And you've got Wiles going, no, that's actually very problematic.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I don't like this not explained by science, so it's God. I think that's problematic.
Yeah.
And as we've discussed, this idea of an extraordinary and kind of fortuitous or very welcome event, well, that's very perspective dependent.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
So, yeah, to go back to some of these like Old Testament miracles, there's an example of the parting of the Red Sea, as we've discussed. Fab for the Israelites because they are able to escape to safety. Not so great for the Egyptians.
Exactly. So it all depends on who's involved, what group, what individual. And that's the thing. Oftentimes in cases like that, or again, 9/11 is another, example there. What's miraculous and wonderful for one person can be disaster and death for another. And it seems very binary and extreme. And that does make it hard, I think, to justify that God is involved. So I think that's where Wells' position can be quite convincing, actually, because this idea that God doesn't intervene, a lot of people might look at that and think, oh, well, you know, that's a sign that God doesn't love us, right? We've got all these terrible things happening, again, problem of evil. And, you know, God is just kind of, as it were, sitting back. But I often use the analogy of a parent, actually, which I think is apt, given that, you know, God is referred to as the father. But if a parent got involved every single time their child was going to make a mistake or just did everything for them, would that child actually grow and develop into its own, you know, mature being? I don't think so. Now, of course, there's exceptions to that, especially, you know, if you've got very young children, like you kind of have to do that. But if you did that for a child their whole life, I think you'd be doing them a big disservice. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, if I kept on, you know, stopping my daughter fall over when she was learning to walk, she wouldn't learn to walk. She'd be like, well, why bother?
And she'd probably be quite scared, actually, I think, as well, wouldn't she? Like, she can't go out and venture on her own and learn and all of that.
You have to let them do a bit of failing and a bit of banging into things. And I think maybe that's what the world is. And John Hick talks about this vale of soul making. That's what the world is. It's basically this big kind of exercise in us learning to be people and to develop our souls. And if God intervenes constantly, then what opportunity do we have to be good?
Yes.
To truly be good and to truly understand the world around us. So maybe it's, you know, as you say, this good parent thing, I need to let you fail so that you can become more successful.
Exactly, in the long run. So, you know, it might be painful in the short term, but actually it's better for you long term, especially if you look at it from the soul making point of view from Hick and others. Have you seen Bruce Almighty?
Yeah.
Great. I was going to play a clip from that, if that's okay.
Go for it.
Because there's quite a good one where God himself, played by the wonderful Morgan Freeman, is talking to Bruce. I play this in my class when I talk about miracles, actually. But yeah, I quite like the way that they talk about it here, actually. I'd love to get your opinion on what's being said.
Parting your soup is not a miracle, Bruce. It's a magic trick. A single mom who's working 2 jobs and still finds time to take her kid to soccer practice, that's a miracle. A teenager who says no to drugs and yes to an education, that's a miracle. People want me to do everything for them, when what they don't realize is they have the power. You want to see a miracle, son? Be the miracle.
Okay, so just a short clip there, but yeah, I'd love to hear your opinion on that as a kind of perspective on miracles and what they mean for us.
I think it's a really human perspective, and I think that's maybe that's not a very fashionable way of talking about it, but that is very compelling because it is empowering to individuals.
Yeah,
and also it's going to allow more concept of miracle for those who want to use that term more widely, if we're thinking of things that are fortuitous. And also, I think it says really interesting things about the nature of God as well. It links into ideas of how humans are, like, if you're a religious believer, created in the image of God to grow into the likeness of God. You know, do we have this ability to demonstrate the face of God within the world around us by acting in ways that we are choosing to? So an exercise in free will in promoting those things that are miraculous in the world. And I think there's something really, really appealing about that. Really appealing because it makes us feel good as well.
Exactly, because it gives us that sense of satisfaction and achievement. And you could tie it into that concept, like you say, free will, and the idea that actually we're exercising it in a way that kind of goes against the odds. Like if you're a single mom working 2 jobs, looking after your children, like, you know, there are a lot of situations where people won't be able to manage that. And then if you're managing to do all these things, it is kind of miraculous, not in the sense that God's intervening, but it's not despite that, it's because of it, because you're the one taking control. So I did a podcast recently on the question of free will, and I think one of the issues with believing that we don't have free will and that God steps in all the time is that it absolves us of any responsibility for the bad things that we do, which is not good, because it means we can't learn, we can't grow, we can't take accountability. But equally, if we do anything good, we have to attribute it to God as well, and I think there's problems with that too.
I totally agree. You know, people talk about like the miracle of childbirth. It's like, actually, I've put a lot of effort into that.
Yeah.
Give me credit, please.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, and I think that's a really, really important point, this idea of responsibility and kind of ownership of the things that we do. And I think that clip demonstrates that really, really successfully. This idea of be the miracle.
Yeah.
We need to look at human beings and what they're doing. And I think that, you know, to go back to that kind of dictionary definition, we can talk about things being wonderful and extraordinary, but maybe our idea of extraordinary is not violations of natural laws.
Yeah.
It's saying, as to use your phrase, against the odds. It's,
yeah.
Is this an unlikely thing, or did this thing require so much more effort than we thought was possible to give?
Exactly. And it's something we can be proud of. And I think it's a view that Hume would definitely take issue with, because, of course, he does have that very strict view, and he doesn't really believe in miracles, A, because he doesn't believe that there are genuine violations of the laws of nature, and B, because of the issues of testimony and witnesses. And this idea, like you said before, we've got this propensity to want to believe in these wonderful stories, even if we can't attribute a source for them, because we just have that desire as humans, and it's part of our human nature. Yeah, it's interesting, actually. One sort of last point that I wanted to make about the clip that we saw is it comes off the back of, for those that don't know Bruce Almighty, it's part of it anyway, is that Bruce takes on the powers of God. And one of the things he has to do is answer prayers. So he gets a lot of what are called petitionary prayers. So people asking for help from God, asking him to intervene. And he gets really fed up at one point. He has an email system of trying to track all the prayers. He goes, you know what? Reply yes to all. And it doesn't take a genius to work out that that's maybe not the best thing to do, given, you know, the nature of what people are praying for. And one of the things that God says to him, actually, he says, you know, Bruce says, I just gave everybody what they wanted. And God comes back and he says, since when have people actually known what they really want? You know, you can think that you want something. Like, I want chocolate cake all the time, but should I have it? Probably not, you know, because it's not particularly healthy. So it's what we want and what's good for us, I think, are two different things. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And I think it would require us to know ourselves in so much more profound a way than we actually could to know exactly what's good for us all of the time.
Exactly.
And I think a lot of people, if they talk about prayer specifically, would say that that's about humans. That's not about God.
Yes,
that's true. About reflecting on our own nature and what we think we need, kind of working out problems. Than it is about God saying, "Cool, I'm going to tap into this list of things you said you wanted, and here they are."
Yeah, exactly. I can't remember who said it, but I think it might have been Jordan Peterson, actually. I watched an interview with him and he said people need to stop treating God as if he's some celestial butler, which I thought was, you know, a fair point. But yeah, it's an interesting one. Great. Okay. Well, are there any sort of like words of wisdom that you would like to leave people with who are interested in this topic? Any sort of final note that you would like to end on when it comes to understanding miracles and thinking about miracles? What do you think is the most kind of compelling thing that we should keep in mind when we come to look at this topic?
I think it's really important to think about how you're defining miracle before you go on to give examples, and also, crucially, criticisms.
Yeah.
Because to criticize something, you need to have explained what it is you're criticizing. Because you can use Hume to criticize miracles, and that is a very different sense of criticism than Wiles will use to criticize miracles. So I'd say that if you're interested in looking at miracle, think about how you're defining it, and have some good examples up your sleeves for different definitions.
I love that. I think that's advice that could be applied to lots of other topics, if not all of them, actually. When you're going to be arguing about something, criticizing it, defending it, make sure you know exactly what it is you're talking about and that you have it clearly defined.
It's a really, really good way of starting an essay as well.
Yeah, define your terms.
That way, defining your terms. And that's a really, really good starting place for revision, actually.
Yes.
Define your term, and then, you know, as soon as you've done that, you've already been thinking about your crucial language, and then you can start bringing in your thinkers. Yeah, defining terms is it's not exciting, but I think it's fertile ground for further thinking.
Definitely. And I think you can acknowledge that there are various different definitions that could be used, Absolutely. But this is the one that you're using. You know, you can say it in that way, so that you can acknowledge that, you know, there's more than one way of looking at the question, but your way is the best, basically. Yes. Not in so many words, but yeah, exactly. Great. Well, some good words of advice there. I think that was a helpful look at, you know, the different ways of interpreting miracles and the idea that it's not purely a religious thing. And I think that's important because, like you say, it's that colloquial use. We can think about the topic from that point of view as well. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining. I'd love to get you back on at some point to discuss maybe a similar topic or something different. So maybe we can look to do that in the future if you're happy to. Brilliant. Okay, well, I'll let you go. Thank you so much again, Alice, and have a wonderful rest of the day.